how's everybody feeling? All right. Reese is feeling okay, and everybody else is blah.
Bleh.
Okay, we're moving slow through chapter 5. Chapter 5, and Jordan was asking, I'm not sure why he was asking, but he was just asking what's going to be the longest section that we have in our Matthew study, and I told him this is probably going to be it. Just from the standpoint that we're looking at every single beatitude by itself, and then the different illustrations that Jesus is giving in this section after the beatitudes, so as to exemplify where all of these attitudes are going to fit in. So as we're going through these illustrations that Christ is giving to us, he is showing to us that in every situation of life, there's going to be an opportunity where the beatitudes are going to fit. Obviously, in a religious setting or in religious dealings, the beatitudes are going to be found in application. If you have aught with your brother and you come to the altar remembering that you have aught with your brother, you leave your gift, go and make things right with your brother, come back and offer your gift. That's a given, okay? This is something that's going to help us in religious things. But then he takes it a step further and he branches it out and shows, okay, even these things that I'm teaching you are going to find application inside of the home, the husband and wife relationship, in dealing with the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Well, if you are practicing these attitudes, there's not going to be any need for divorce and looking for another mate. You then have the situation, this would be like even in business, dealing with business dealings, going into contract with your fellow brethren. If you give your word that you're going to do something, then you need to keep your word. And if you're following these principles of the Beatitudes, that you're concerned about others, you're not concerned about yourself, you are desiring to honor God and uphold that which is right, then you're going to follow through and do these different things. And then he moves on into another section of study, which also what he's been dealing with is he's been teaching against a manipulation of what God has actually said. So while he's going through and he's showing to us how it is that these things fit into all of our lives, he's at the same time battling false teaching that's been presented for thousands of years. You've heard it said, thou shalt not kill, all right? But what about being angry with your brother? Okay, we're not touching that. If you want to be angry, that's a natural emotion. Everybody gets angry. That's fine. Just don't kill anybody. Well, no, you can't have it both ways. That in fact, if you're going to be involved in killing somebody, murdering somebody, it starts from a position of having hatred in your heart. And you cannot love your brother and hate your brother at the same time. It's got to be one or the other. So even as we move forward in verses 38 through 42, Jesus again is going to touch on another element of the law and how it is that the Jews are manipulating what it is that the law is saying, and Jesus gives the proper interpretation of what's being taught. So that was another point that we made in going through the section, that Jesus did not just put up with everybody's interpretation of the law and say, well, okay, that's your interpretation, fine. Jesus came and set the record straight. Here's what your interpretation is, but it's wrong. And it's going to judge people and it's going to condemn people. Here's the proper interpretation. You've heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. Now, the question that needs to be asked in this section is, how would this be carried out? And that's an important question to ask, because there are even individuals today that have a false interpretation and a false view about this section. That if you're not understanding what was already being presented in the law, then you're not going to get a proper interpretation of what's being presented here. So just as we said in our introduction to the book of Matthew, that if you do not know anything about the Old Testament, then when you come into this study, you're going to be lost. That you're going to have at least a brief concept and knowledge of, okay, he's pulling this from somewhere. You've heard that it hath been said. Well, where's it been said? It's been said in the law. And the law clearly says it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, when we come to this section and we have different, like with our own brethren and different things, what are some ideas that come about when you think about this section? Like just first glance, knee-jerk reaction, what do you think he's teaching? Okay, to just be a pushover. If somebody comes along, tries to sue you, okay, let him sue you. Compels you to go a mile, go two. If they ask thee from him that would borrow thee, turn thou not away, just give it over. Somebody comes up and decides to smite you, you offer the other cheek. Anything else?
He also tried to God of the Bible.
Okay, all right. So here would be another place where individuals are trying to look at, well, here's the God of the Old Testament, and it's vengeance. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But again, here comes Christ, and he says, no, it's not eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but in fact, if somebody smite thee, you offer the other cheek. Now, again, this is not so, just as what Jordan's mentioning there, this is not a contradiction that Jesus is trying to present. Jesus is still going to exemplify, and he's still going to practice eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, because that's God's law. But what he is showing is that in all things, it's not this, and even in this situation, in all things, it's not this either. That depending on what the situation is and the circumstances of what we're being faced with, sometimes you're going to practice this, sometimes you're going to practice this. And it ultimately comes down to judgment call as to what it is that we're going to decide to do in these situations. So the question is being asked, how would this be carried out? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Then the question has to be asked, can I just take this into my own hands? What we're dealing with is a false concept of what the Jews are saying. Okay, Jews are saying if you want to be angry and hate your brother, fine, just don't kill him. Well, okay, what about this situation where somebody comes along and smites me? What can I do? Well, the law says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You just rear back and you clock whoever it was that hit you. But in all circumstances, we're going to find out that that's not going to be the right thing to do. So in fact, we can go back to our 1 Corinthians study where Paul is addressing the eating of meats that have been offered unto idols. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul actually says, by inspiration, all things are lawful unto me. But then there's a qualifier. All things are lawful, but what?
Why?
All right. All things are not expedient. That in fact, I may have a legal right to do something. But just because I have a legal right to do something does not mean that it's actually going to be the best course of action. So what we actually have being addressed here, how it is that this would be carried out, here is what the Old Testament actually says about it. Exodus chapter 21, beginning in verse 22. If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So who gets to decide how this is carried out? Now, we've not gotten to the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth section, but this is in the same context. You notice this is going before the magistrates. This is going before judges. So Jordan comes up and hits me or does something to me. I can't just take it upon myself to just all of a sudden turn around and now I get to pass judgment on what Jordan did. We've got to go to court over this. So even here, we have further explanation about the 1 Corinthians chapter 6 problem of going to court before the world. Is it wrong, like wrong in all cases, to go to court? No, clearly it's not, because this is God's law. Something happens, and even here in this context of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, notice it's in the context of a woman being with child. This is the serious nature of where God is giving this rule of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Two men are fighting, and a woman gets in the way, and she's with child. That's pretty serious. If nothing happens, if she's hurt, but there's no mischief, well, then the husband gets to decide, here's what I would like to see happen. The judges get to determine whether that's right, where the punishment fits the crime or not. Verse 23, and if any mischief follow, so the child dies in the womb, then thou shalt give life for life. And here's where the teaching comes in. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, with that kind of context where this statement is being made, do I get to apply this to any frivolous situation? No, I don't. This is for weighty matters where this type of punishment and this type of judgment starts coming in. So I cannot start looking at every little situation that comes along and that starts happening to me to where I get to turn around and say, well, okay, I get to retaliate. I get to pass this kind of judgment on you. That's not fair. And a lot of the times, the punishment is not going to fit the crime. So here's the severity of what's going on. Two men are in an altercation, woman gets in the way, she gets hurt, but the child's not lost. All right, the judges step in and they determine what's going to be the punishment. But if the child be lost, then here's what the rule is: life for life. That's murder. So the law for murder is, you shed man's blood, by man's hands shall your blood be shed. So even right there, there's another good, here's another good passage for the proof of life in the womb. That's not just a lump of cells. That here God says, you do this to a woman and the child dies, you're the one that is going to end up being killed, because it's life for life. So when we're considering it from this aspect, I do not then get to take this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and remove it from its context and then start trying to apply it to everything else. That's what the Jews were doing. Everything they're looking at is at this severity, when in reality, that's not the case. There are some things that might end up happening to us that's just like, what? This isn't that big of a deal. And even in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul addresses that very thing. Paul says, instead of going to court over all of these small matters, what does he actually say about it? What should I do instead of going to court? All right, reconcile if you can, but what if you can't reconcile? Suffer the loss. Suffer the wrong. And we're going to see that Jesus is going to illustrate that even further with his own life. So here's what we actually have being taught from what Jesus is presenting. This is a guarding against revenge and retaliation. Because most of the time, when you start bringing personal retaliation into a situation like this, do you end up doing what's just? Or do you not end up going to an extreme? You end up going to an extreme. And it's understandable. Somebody's done wrong to you, and what's the mentality? Well, I'm going to get you back. You're going to get your just deserves, and you're going to get it through me. But God had implemented a system to where, even if something like this did happen, and it clearly happened, you still had to go before the judges. You could not just take it into your own hands, because if you do that and you allow personal feelings to get in the way, you are not going to be able to practice justice. And there's a difference between justice and vengeance. It's a thin line, but there is a line. So it is a protection for the justice system to be able to do what it's supposed to do, not going beyond what punishment is deserved. And so this is defending against personal retaliation, personal attacks, and we're being taught the importance of justice from this section. God cares about justice. In fact, one of the things that he condemned Old Testament Israel for was their perverting of justice. But justice has its limits, to where if you are actually going to be just, then you cannot bring a punishment on somebody that's greater than what they actually deserve. So let's try to illustrate this, even further. Someone comes in, let's just say, I'm here, Jordan comes in, he decides he's going to cut my finger off. Or let's say he comes in and he decides to pull a Peter and he cuts my ear off. Now, how might I handle that situation if I am allowed personal retaliation to take over? Am I just going to take a finger or an ear? No, I might come in with the idea that, well, he took my ear, I'm just going to take his head off. And that's not how it works. So with this, it's the idea that we're protecting not only the person who's had wrong done to them, but it's a protection for the rest of society, to where other individuals are going to step in and they're going to say, hey, this is what's going to happen. So so this is the purpose of the Jewish law and the Jewish system. The punishment must fit the crime. And it did not go beyond what the crime that is committed. So this actually cuts out and cuts down on family feuds. It cuts down on tribe tension. Because under the Old Testament system, you have the 12 tribes of Israel, and guess what? If somebody from another tribe came in and did something wrong, what would be the mentality of the tribe that was wronged? Well, let's get everybody together and let's go to war, and let's just take them over. This cuts down on that. And you read from the Old Testament that those type of things happened. The 12 tribes actually did go to war with each other at different points. When they're under the same system and they're all connected through family ties, but personal retaliation, personal feelings get in the way of that, and you completely ignore that these are in fact our brethren that we're actually going and fighting with. So when we're considering what the Jews are doing, and we're going to see it illustrated here in just a little bit as we move through some other verses. Here's what's taking place. You've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill. So let's make connection here. As we said, all these principles, all these attitudes, these topics, they're intertwined together. Now, put what we've just looked at here with eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, with this section. Put all this together, what we've already learned. You've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. So the Jews are saying, do not kill him. All right? But I've got an altercation. I'm in an altercation with my brother. All right. I'm not controlling my anger, so I'm not going to kill him, but man, I'll beat him within an inch of death. Can't do that. But the Jews would look at this and they would say, all right, seems fair. And certainly, considering the position that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were in, if they allowed other people to do that type of thing, then what does that allow them to do? The exact same thing. Why is it that the Pharisees, Sadducees, the high priest would go about and try to do the things to Jesus that they did to him? Because of what we're discussing here. Personal retaliation. Personal vengeance. to where they would go against the Son of God and bring about false witness. And even they themselves, they would try to excuse themselves in saying, well, we can't kill him, but Pilate, you can. And that's just foolishness. We know from the law that they could, in fact, put a blasphemer to death. Moses said that, chapter 18 and in chapter 19, that if a prophet comes in and he tries to teach you to do something outside of the law of God, you put him to death. If he made a prophecy and the prophecy does not come true, you put that prophet to death. That was in their law. Well, Jesus came in as a prophet. If he's a false prophet, they had every right, according to the law, to put him to death. But when you let personal things get in the way, these are the type of games that you play. To where you'll look at this system and you'll say, okay, I won't kill him, but hey, it's eye for an eye. Not in every situation. Not all the time. So it cures this situation here, but even this idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, it fixes the divorce problem. Your spouse does something that you don't like, well, okay, if it's eye for an eye, then I'll fix you. Then bam, divorce. This is what this teaching is helping to work against. It is working against the idea that I have got to retaliate in every situation. That in fact, in some situations, it's not good to retaliate. That it's not good to revile back. Or to start throwing insults back at those that are trying to, do that to us. And we can, so just even in our personal applications, going over here to our brethren and trying to work things out, and one of our brethren wants to start, calling us worms. Okay, we could have gone tit for tat. All right, you're calling us a bunch of worms. Well, your mama's an elephant. We can play that game. But what good would it do? It wouldn't do any good, and in fact, it would end up putting us down in the same position where they are. All right, you want to call us worms? Fine, I don't have to retaliate. I don't have to, bite back on that. Say what you like. So this goes back. So as we're moving forward, the teachings continue to step backwards and covering back everything which we've been discussing up to this point. So verse 39. We've looked at what the law says. Now let's look at what Jesus says here. But I say unto you that you resist not evil. Literally, that's to be translated that you resist not the evil one or the evil person. And that you're not giving back reviling words, or you're not biting back on these individuals that are trying to bite you. So you do not repel one outrage by another. You don't try to calm things down by continuing to extend or fight back in the way in which they're fighting back. But even still, when we're considering the idea of what's being discussed here, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. A lot of times when we think about this passage, this is what we're thinking about. Somebody's just coming along and man, they are just going to belt you. But that's not what's being discussed here. The idea of smiting is, again, it's just a personal insult. And so I've heard in different interviews or whatever of different boxers and different fighters, different things, and them saying that they would much rather take a fist to the face than just to have some guy come up and open hand slap. And it's just like, well, that slap really doesn't hurt like the fist. It's like, well, it really doesn't, but it's embarrassing. It ends up doing something to your ego when instead of just somebody coming up and hitting you with a fist, instead they slap you across the face. And it's just like, what is that? And that does something to where just like it causes you to boil. And that's the type of practice that they had at this time. to where you read through the New Testament and you will read of several times where the Sanhedrin, the high priest, will just openly slap somebody. It's a personal attack. It's a personal affront. It's designed to make you feel less of a man by doing that. So when we're thinking about this idea of smiting you on the cheek, we're not needing to think of this. But instead, we're thinking of like it is, just an open hand. So what happens when you are injured or insulted in this type of way? Self comes in or has the desire to come in. And it looks for retaliation. But Jesus says, no, if we're looking at it from this standpoint, from the proper standpoint, and in the proper context, somebody smites you, you don't have to turn around and smite them. So in fact, Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5 comes into play, which says, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like unto him. In these type of situations where we have this being shown to us where it ends up happening, the person that does the smiting looks really bad. And the one who is able to control himself. So we're right back in the attitude of meekness. Meekness is strength under control. That says, okay, yeah, you've hit me. I have a right to hit you back. But I'm not going to do that because I don't want to be considered, I don't want to be looked at the same way that you're being viewed at this moment. But at the same time, that Proverbs 26:4 says what it says. What does verse 5 say? Verse 4 says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. But what do you think verse 5 ends up saying? No, it says, do answer the fool according to his folly, lest he thinks himself to be wise in his own conceit. So the proverb writer, Proverbs 26 verses 4 and 5, is not a cut and dry situation. You cannot look at verse 4 and say, okay, it says there, don't answer a fool according to his folly, so that means all the time. No, you've got to look at the situation and you've got to figure out, is there actually going to bring about any type of benefit with me arguing with this person? And then verse 5 shows the other side of that. There is a time in which you do answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. And so it's going to be the same situation here with turning the other cheek. This is an extreme illustration. And when we're considering, when we're making the applications that we're making, you apply this back to hating your brother, and you apply this back to the husband-wife relationship, and even with the idea of making oaths, swearing and making promises. You take this back into those things, then guess what you end up doing in those situations? All right, I've got a brother that's got all with me. I'm not going to retaliate on him. I'm going to go and try to fix it. The husband does something wrong. The wife doesn't think, well, okay, I'm going to get him back. I'm just going to go on and behave like I need to behave. I make a promise to do something, and it actually comes around to bite me. Well, I'm not going to do anything to try to get out of it. I'm going to keep my word, just like I said I would. And it falls right back into what Jesus has already said about blessing, being blessed when people persecute you. Back in verse 10, blessed are they which are persecuted. Notice, for righteousness' sake. Why are these things happening to me? Why is this person hitting me? It's for righteousness' sake. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Well, if it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, if they're reviling me, then I'm going to revile right back. No, I'm not. If they persecute me because I'm weaker than they are, Well, when I become strong, then I'm going to persecute them right back. No, that's not what we do. And you can even see that being illustrated under the Old Testament system when the children of Israel are brought out of Egyptian bondage. Here the Egyptians have been cruel to the children of Israel. But then what does God say to them when they come out? How do they treat the Egyptians? Is it eye for an eye? No. God says, now that you are in power and you've been set free, you do not persecute the Egyptians just because they persecuted you. You do not end up being cruel to strangers. And God says, because you ought to remember what it was like to be a stranger. So again, going through these things helps to build the other characteristics. As we said about blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And you remember, we went through the study and we made the point that it's only those that have been persecuted, that have been mistreated, and have received mercy that really understand what it is to be merciful. As we said, the greatest example that Jesus gave about that was the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan. Why would he just help some stranger on the road? Because the Samaritan knew what it was like to be despised. The Jews hated the Samaritans. And the Jews did everything they could not to have to deal with the Samaritans. I want to give some explanation, but I'm going to save it for later because it really helps to prove the point stronger. But just rest assured that when the Jews' relationship with the Samaritans, if they could do anything they could to stay away from a Samaritan, they would do it. And yet, in that parable that Jesus gives, it's a Samaritan that does what a priest and a Levite will not do. So as we're going through and we're being reviled and we're being persecuted, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, and that for his sake, and we endure it. We put up with it. We bear up underneath it. What's that going to help us to appreciate? It's going to help us to appreciate God's mercy. It's going to help us to appreciate grace. And that when the time comes for us to return that, even on those that would have been persecuting us, we'll do it. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. This is the context of where Jesus is making this statement about if someone smite you, turn the other cheek. You are being persecuted for the cause, for the sake of the kingdom, and for that of righteousness. You endure it. You're being insulted. You're being spoken against. Now, some would look at this, and what Jesus is addressing, he's dealing with the attitude, that personal attitude, selfishness, and the desire to retaliate. And some might look at this and say, well, that's asking a lot. It is asking a lot. But Christianity asks a lot of us. But just as we've said, what Jesus is teaching here, he himself is going to practice. So he's not asking us to do something that he himself is not willing to do. And we'll see some of those verses in a moment. So the question must be asked, is this a cut and dry response to all situations? No, it's not. If somebody tries to break into my home at night, the Old Testament law still applies. You try to break into my house at night, I'm putting you down. But Jesus said, no, that's not the context. What Jesus is discussing is not somebody just being evil and just trying to do harm to others. Because to take this to its ultimate extreme to where we can't do anything about any type of injustice, then what happens to the justice system? Like we're saying, if you carry this out to its fullest extreme, it's chaos. I don't know where my clicker's going. You would just have brawling in the streets all the time. There's a principle that's being set. And just imagine the chaos that would ensue if this statement is followed to its most literal extent. I couldn't do anything to protect myself, to protect my wife, to protect, the fatherless, protect widows. Couldn't do anything if that's what Jesus is saying. It's in the context of enduring these things for righteousness' sake. I am being smitten, I am being cursed, I am being abused because I'm seeking after the kingdom. And we can see that being illustrated in the life of Christ. John chapter 18, verse 22 and 23. When he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand. That's what we're talking about. And this is in court. This is a religious thing. This is the high priest. Jesus is in court before he's to be crucified. And this is what ends up happening. Struck with the palm of his hand, saying, "Answerest thou the high priest so?" So why did the high priest have this man hit Jesus? Personal retaliation. How dare you talk to the high priest like that? This does not fit this. But this is what the Jews were doing on a continual basis. Verse 23, Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me?" So even right here, Jesus gives a response. Jesus points out to the fact, you did something that was unlawful. Not me. So even right there, what are we being shown? Jesus does not hit back, and that's the point. But at the same time, Jesus was not a pushover. He is still standing up for what's right. If I've done anything evil, then show it. Bear witness of it. Well, you can't? Well, then what you did was in fact evil. So you see, we're not just laying down. It's just that we're not behaving the way that they behave. We run over to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 23, verses 1 and 2. Or 1 through 3, excuse me. Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest, Ananias, commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. This is the kind of situation that we're talking about. If somebody smite thee, you turn the other cheek. Again, Paul is in court. And he's being called into court because of what he's teaching. And what happens while he's here? He's been smote on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, "God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten," notice, "contrary to the law." Paul's no pushover. I'm not going to hit you back, but I'm for sure going to point out to you that what you've done is wrong. You have done something contrary to the law. We do not get down in their level. These are the times in which we're saying, all right, you got to turn the other cheek. Over there with our brethren, if that one brother had desired to, that's, calling us worms, if he had tried to hit me, all right, he's going to hit me. And I'm not going to hit him back. Now, you best believe I'm going to be pointing out to him, brother, if you don't repent of this, if you don't fix your attitude, you're going to hell. But what good would it do for the two of us to start brawling right there in the church building? in the name of Christ. It doesn't do any good. But what does is for people to see that, okay, here's somebody who's actually being held to a higher standard. To where in a normal situation, yeah, fight would have broken out. Between the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Jews, they're fighting all the time. But yet here's a Christian. And look at how he is. There's your light shining. Here they are, and they struck him in the mouth unlawfully. And he calmly just says, you shouldn't have done that. And that in fact, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. So even there, it's the idea. I don't have to retaliate because God is going to retaliate for me. And when God brings retaliation, it's far greater than anything that I could ever dream of being able to do. Thus, what Peter says, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. Here we have further illustration and further teaching as we move into the New Testament. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judged righteously. Now again, that's asking a lot. But Christianity asks a lot. If we are going to be a called out set of people, if we're going to be sanctified to where we do not behave like the rest of the world, then we've got to be willing to do this. To where we're just having calm, civil conversation, Bible study, and then somebody wants to get upset and start reviling, start cursing. I don't have to retaliate to that. Be on live television and somebody wants to start talking ugly about my wife. I don't have to retaliate to that. And that's a literal example. I've had that happen. You just don't give in to it. And people will look at that and they will see, okay, I've seen other preachers get down and start playing this game. But then here's somebody who doesn't do that. Now, like we said, he's not a pushover. But he does not resort back down to these type of tactics. Well, if that's how he will behave with some stranger that calls him up on live television, then how would he treat me if I were to be a brother or sister in Christ? So it goes even further to the idea of what Jesus even presents, loving your enemies. If this is how we will treat those that despise us, then how will we treat each other? Better. Going back to verse 40, if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. Again, this is in the context for the sake of righteousness. Now, according to the law, this is illegal. Verse 20, Exodus 22:26, if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. For that is his covering only, it is his raiment for his skin, wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass, when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious. Under the law, you could take the inner cloak, but you could not take the outer cloak. Because just as the law says, That's his skin. That's for his warmth. And if he does give this to you for pledge, you give it back to him before the sun goes down. Why? Because that's just right and that's fair and that's just. But you have individuals that are going to try to manipulate the law and go for the eye. And they're going to do this to you because you're simply a Christian. Jesus says, okay, if they're going to be that ugly, then let everybody see them be ugly. And you let it happen. But again, we cannot press this into every event. In this type of situation, you do not return suit. You accept the mistreatment, but that does not mean that we do not stand up for what is honorable and what is right. An illustration of that is Acts chapter 16, verse 36. And the keeper of the prison told this saying to Paul, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. Paul and Silas have been put in prison. They've been beaten unjustly. And then they find out Paul is a Roman citizen. They know that they are in big trouble. And here's what they try to do. They try to say to Paul, okay, just go. We're letting you go. But that's not right. They are being charged as doing something wrong as Christians. Paul then turns around and Paul said unto them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily, but let them come themselves and fetch us out. Paul stands up and he says, no, you've done this openly. You're going to let us go openly. We're going to make a show of this. Now, is that contradicting what Jesus said? No, it's not. Because you cannot press what's being taught there into every single situation. And even when it comes down to, to Paul, he's brought to court again in Acts chapter 24 through 26. And how is it that Paul ends up finding himself going to Rome? He appeals to Caesar. He uses his Roman citizenship to his advantage. And we've even seen it earlier in the life of Paul, that when it came to certain situations where they're coming to arrest him, Paul didn't let them arrest him. He ran. What's that called when you run from the police? Yeah, you're fleeing justice. Well, is it really fleeing from justice, what they're wanting to do? No, it's not. So when we're considering what it is that's being implemented to us, if you have a chance to run, run. But if you end up finding yourself being caught, here's how you need to behave. If you find yourself being taken to court, and it's by brethren, suffer the wrong. And then even looking at verse 41, whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Now this has the classical usage strictly referring to Persian system of mounted couriers. That under Persian law, if somebody came to your house and said, hey, we need you to carry this, then you'd have to do it. Now, you take into consideration the time frame in which Jesus is saying this and the Jews are living. They are under Roman rule. So what if a Roman governor comes to you and he says, hey, we need you to take it to here? Jesus says you don't fight against that. You don't get upset. You don't get grumpy. You go with him twain. Okay, you called me to take this 1 mile. I'll go 2. to where what we actually have happening is a holding back of our personal rights and our personal liberties. Because we have to take into consideration Romans chapter 13. Who establishes governments? God does. And even with this, we're trying to balance the fact that, okay, God establishes governments, but God desires and He even commands governments to be run certain ways. And what if government is not run that way? Then who's to say that I'm supposed to listen to government if they're not listening to God? But does that mean that I just go out of my way to make it hard for government to do what it's supposed to do? No. I get pulled over, the policeman wants to see my license and registration. I'm not going to be a jerk about that. Just not. Because what's the point? But then we have other situations where we can see a rising affront to government is wanting to do things that are just flat out evil. So I'm not needing to look at every situation where the government is telling me to do something and I need to kick against it. But everything is being weighed out. A government official comes and asks me to do something that's within their purview to be able to do that, then okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it happily. So the post-classical usage refers to the later development of a system not of postage, but forced transport of military baggage. This is how this is being used in the first century language, in the first century context. And we can even see that being illustrated in Matthew chapter 27, verse 31. And after that they had mocked him, and they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him, led him away to crucify him. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. You have Roman soldiers, and they're picking somebody from the crowd, and they're saying, okay, he can't carry his cross, you carry it. All right, fine. Roman soldier had every right to do that, given the circumstance. And even with this, you take into consideration what is happening, and that here is the Son of God, and he is being beaten down, and he's being burdened under the load that he's carrying. And then somebody from the government steps in and says, well, do this. I need to look beyond that to the actual situation, to where I'm not looking at the fact, well, here's this government official telling me what to do. Who do they think they are? Let me look at this, and it's just like, well, you don't even have to compel me. You don't have to twist my arm for this. Of course, let me help the Son of God carry this cross. So as we're considering these points, so let's just put it in some modern day application. Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. This not only would have within it the Roman context and Roman government, but of course, as we're discussing it, as Jesus is discussing it, he's discussing it from the standpoint of Jewish system. The Jewish rulers coming to you and compelling you by their religious duty and their civil duty. Here's what you're needing to do. Well, Jesus will say in Matthew chapter 23, what they teach you to observe, you observe and do. Because it's according to the law. But you do not do after their practices. the things which are lawful, and that the government is compelling you to do these things, then do them. But when it comes down to things like we're forcing you to take a vaccine, I'm not doing that. You don't have the right to make me do that. And then just the fact that there's still, and just from the standpoint of there's too many broken promises about what the quote-unquote vaccine is supposed to do. And I really don't understand why they're still calling it a vaccine when they should be just calling it a drug. Because a vaccine is designed to stop whatever the disease is. The reason why we're no longer having to deal with measles is because there was a vaccine and it stopped the spread of measles. And here's our government, and they're saying, take this shot, and it's supposed to stop this, and now they're having to turn around and say, well, actually, it's not going to stop this, but it will make everything weaker. You're not going to compel me to do that. You have no right to do that. And the very fact that you're lying to me about it. So what about even with the Jewish system? All right, if the Levites, and just consider it, the Jews at this point are in a deep state of corruption. But yet they are still teaching people, well, you've got to come to the temple and you've got to bring your tithes. Well, that's right. God has ordered me that I'm supposed to still do that. And just because it's these corrupt false teachers coming to me and telling me to do this, I don't need to kick against it. I need to do it. Not because they're telling me to do it, but because it's the right thing to do. And so that's really what it boils back down to, is the moral right of the situation. They're compelling me to come and do something. All right. It's right for me to do it. I'm going to do it happily. And I'm not going to go out of my way so as to make it difficult in what they're trying to have us do. Verse 42, give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. As we've said, this is not a cut and dry situation, because we know there are other passages that are going to dictate to us that in fact are going to tell us there are some people you don't need to help. But if we take what Jesus is saying and isolate it from everything else that's being taught, then I can see how people would come across this just, well, give to him that asks thee. Anybody that hits you up on the street, hey, I need some money. Well, Jesus says to give it. I don't have to do that. But at the same time, I'm not needing to build up an attitude to where I just completely refuse to help anybody. So in fact, this teaching is helping us to strike up a balance of everything that's being required of us. This is dealing with the attitude of selfishness. It's helping us to become more unselfish. And this is not commanding you to help everyone that comes along begging. It's not just simply turning us into yes men, to where everything that comes along, well, you just got to do it. You just got to say yes. No, there are plenty of times where I can say no. Or if somebody comes and asks me to do something, hey, go a mile with me. No, I don't necessarily have to do that. But in the situations where I am being compelled to do it, I'm going to do it happily. And I'm going to strive to go the extra mile. We have, for example, 2 Thessalonians 3, 7 and verse 10, for yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you. For even when we were with you, this we would command you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. So what if somebody comes along asking, well, hey, I need money so as to buy food. Some would try to take this and say, well, you just got to give it to them. No, I can ask them, well, when's the last time you worked? What's the last job that you held down? What are you trying to do so as to be able to work and be able to feed yourself? You can't take this and isolate it. Because even under the Old Testament system, yes, they were benevolent. God commanded them, you do not gather the corner of your fields. That's for the poor. That's for the widow. That's for the fatherless. But if you notice, God did not tell the Israelites, okay, gather it up, box it up, take it to the poor's house. He told the poor, you come and gather this. You want it, you work for it. But people have come along and they've even corrupted this. The whole soup kitchen idea, where you just come and we just feed you, that's not biblical. Because all you're doing is you're enabling people to be beggars. If we're going to feed you, we're going to put you to some type of work. So that you're able to then say, well, yeah, in fact, I have been working, so I deserve to be able to eat. But you have, with the Jews at this time, all of this is dealing with the Jewish system at the time. You have them turning these type of people away on a regular basis. The very ones that you're supposed to be that you're supposed to be helping, the fatherless and the widows, the Jews are taking advantage of. You're taking advantage of the ones that you're supposed to be helping, and then you turn around and help the ones that you're not supposed to be helping. And Jesus is coming so as to set all of that straight. So as we're being told, this does not mean that there are not people, so even as we're considering this, we can't take this to the fullest extreme to where we just do not help anybody. It's balancing. There are people that need to be helped, but there are some people that just don't need to be helped. And then we have to try to weigh through it. And we have to try to figure out, okay, who can we help and who can we not? But with these Beatitudes, we're going to be drawn to the first reaction of, well, we want to help, but we're going to have to vet you. So the Beatitudes will not make it an obligation for us to help people. It's like, well, I just got to help them. No, it will help produce within us a heart that says, I want to help. And so again, I was very, very glad when certain ones here approached me asking if I knew of anybody in Kentucky or Tennessee or whatever states were affected by the tornado, and if they needed help. Because that's the very thing that Jesus is trying to implement here. We're looking on the affairs of others. We're concerned about others to where we will help. Where if somebody comes and asks us, hey, yeah, I need help, my first reaction is, yeah, I want to help. But again, I'm not going to be a pushover. And just because you give me some sob story does not mean that I'm not going to be running through it with a fine-tooth comb to try to figure out, are you somebody that really needs help? Or are you just somebody that's trying to work the system? Or are you somebody that's actually trying to play off of my desire to help and do what's right, just so that you can be out, go out here and be lazy and be a bum? That is what Jesus is bringing into view. You don't go to the one extreme and you don't go to the other. You're trying to hold a balance as to what's happening here. So, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn that not away. You're going to borrow it, you got to bring it back. And so we'll stop there with verse 42, and we'll save the conclusion of chapter 5 for next time, just because, again, there's so much in it that we want to make sure that it has its, has its own section where we can really dig into it, and then just on top of that, we're out of time. But any other thoughts, questions, comments on eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, turning the other cheek, going the extra mile? All right. And if there's nothing else, then we'll take a short pause and get things transitioned over.